February 1944. Normandy Bocage, 0847 hours. The morning mist clings to the hedgerows like wet cloth. Somewhere in the tangled green maze of northern France, a British Sherman crew sits motionless in their tank, engine idling low, listening. The air smells of diesel and damp earth. Through the periscope, Sergeant James Cartwright watches the tree line, ancient oaks casting long shadows across a narrow farm road. His hands rest on the turret traverse, slick with sweat despite the cold. In his chest, his heart beats against his ribs like a prisoner against bars. He knows what hunts these fields. He has heard the stories whispered in the tank parks at night, stories of tigers, of panzer battalions that crushed entire companies, of armor so thick that British shells bounced off like pebbles thrown at cathedral walls. But today, Cartwright's Sherman is different. Bolted to its turret is a gun the Germans do not yet know, a gun that will rewrite the arithmetic of armored war. The Sherman tank arrived in Europe carrying the weight of industrial democracy on its riveted shoulders, a machine built not for elegance, but for overwhelming numerical presence. American factories churned them out at a pace that defied comprehension. Nearly 50,000 Shermans rolled off assembly lines between 1942 and 1945, a mechanical flood that no other nation could match. They crossed the Atlantic in convoys, disembarked at Liverpool and Southampton, and rumbled through English lanes toward staging areas where young men learned to crew them. British tankers called them Ronsons after the cigarette lighter, because they had a grim habit of igniting when hit. The nickname was not affection. It was fatalism wrapped in dark humor. The Sherman's main gun, the 75mm M3, could penetrate roughly 3 inches of armor at 500 yards under ideal conditions. It was adequate against Panzer III's and early Panzer IV's. But by 1944, the Wehrmacht had fielded something else entirely. The Tiger Y, with its 88mm gun and frontal armor exceeding 4 inches thick, could kill a Sherman from 2,000 yards. The Panther, sleeker and faster, boasted sloped armor that made it nearly invulnerable from the front at combat ranges. German tank commanders in Normandy fought with calm, methodical confidence. They positioned their Tigers in hull-down defensive positions, turrets barely visible over ridgelines, and picked off advancing Shermans one after another. The tactical doctrine was simple. Let the Allies come. Let them expose themselves in the open fields. Then destroy them at leisure. Oberst Heinrich von Rosen, commanding a Tiger company in Panzer Lehr Division, wrote in his diary on June 14, 1944, "The enemy sends his Shermans forward in great numbers, but they are little more than mobile coffins. Our 88s tear through them as if they were made of tin. The American gun is pathetic, a pop gun against our armor. Their crews show courage, but courage without adequate weaponry is only a faster route to death." This was not arrogance. It was mathematics. The Sherman's 75mm could only reliably penetrate a Tiger's side or rear armor. Frontally, it was helpless. Allied tank crews developed desperate tactics, swarm attacks where 4 or 5 Shermans would advance simultaneously, accepting losses to maneuver 1 or 2 tanks into flanking positions. The cost was staggering. In the weeks following D-Day, entire armored battalions were gutted in the Bocage. Their burned-out hulls left smoking in the fields like offerings to some ancient god of war. German commanders mocked the Sherman openly. Propaganda leaflets dropped over Allied lines featured cartoons of tiny Shermans fleeing giant Tigers. Captured Wehrmacht intelligence reports dismissed American armor as quantity masquerading as quality, a philosophy that sacrificed trained men to preserve an outdated industrial model. There was truth in this assessment. American armored doctrine prioritized mobility and mass production over individual tank superiority. The Sherman was designed to be replaced, not to dominate. But in that design philosophy lay a vulnerability that German tankers exploited ruthlessly. Then the British did something unexpected. In early 1944, British ordnance engineers took the Sherman's turret and ripped out the 75mm gun. In its place, they installed the 17-pounder, a long-barreled, high-velocity anti-tank gun that had already proven itself in the North African desert. The 17-pounder fired a projectile at nearly 3,000 feet per second, more than 1,000 feet per second faster than the Sherman's original gun. Its armor-piercing discarding sabot rounds could penetrate over 5 inches of armor at 1,000 yards. The British called this hybrid the Sherman Firefly. From the outside, the Firefly looked almost identical to a standard Sherman. The same boxy hull, the same suspension, the same tracks. Only the gun betrayed its identity, slightly longer, slightly thicker at the breech. This resemblance was deliberate. British crews were instructed to camouflage their Fireflies to blend with standard Shermans to avoid attracting German fire. Because the Germans, once they learned what the Firefly could do, would prioritize killing them above all else. Production began in early 1944. By D-Day, British armored regiments were deploying Fireflies in ratios of 1 per troop, 4 or 5 tanks with 1 Firefly hidden among them. The crews selected for Fireflies were often the most experienced, men who understood angles and distances, who could identify a tiger silhouette at 1,000 yards through morning fog. They were hunters now, not prey, but the gun alone was not enough. The Firefly's ammunition made it lethal. The armor-piercing discarding sabot round, APDS for short, was a marvel of metallurgy and desperation. A dense tungsten core wrapped in a lightweight sabot that fell away after firing, allowing the core to maintain velocity over long distances. When it struck armor, it did not explode. It simply penetrated, a hypervelocity needle punching through steel plate and continuing into the tank's interior, where it ricocheted and fragmented, turning the crew compartment into a chamber of high-speed shrapnel. German tankers had never encountered anything like it. Their Tigers and Panthers had been designed to defeat conventional armor-piercing shells, which lost energy rapidly and could be deflected by sloped armor. The APDS round ignored those calculations. In late June 1944, near the town of Villers-Bocage, a Firefly commanded by Sergeant Gordon Bramwell engaged a Tiger I at just over 800 yards. The Tiger was stationary, positioned behind a stone wall with only its turret visible, a classic German defensive setup. Bramwell's gunner, Trooper Harris, laid the 17-pounder's crosshairs on the Tiger's turret front and fired. The APDS round struck just below the gun mantlet. There was no dramatic explosion, only a sharp crack like a whip snapping. The Tiger did not move. Smoke began seeping from its hatches. 30 seconds later, the crew bailed out, stumbling into a ditch. When British infantry inspected the Tiger afterward, they found the tungsten core had punched clean through the frontal armor, severed the main gun's breech mechanism, and killed the gunner instantly. German after-action reports began noting a disturbing pattern. Tigers that had been considered invulnerable were being knocked out at ranges previously thought safe. Panzer commanders reported unknown high-velocity weapon in their situation briefings. Oberst von Rosen, the same officer who had mocked the Sherman 75mm, wrote on July 3rd, "We have encountered a new enemy weapon, a Sherman variant with a gun that penetrates our frontal armor. This changes everything. We can no longer sit passively and destroy them at range. They can kill us now." The psychological impact was immediate and profound. For years, German tank crews had operated with the assurance of technical superiority. The Tiger and Panther were symbols of German engineering excellence, physical manifestations of the Reich's belief in its own qualitative supremacy. German tankers had watched Allied armor burn and felt validated. Their machines were better, therefore they were better. The Firefly shattered that certainty. Now every Sherman was a potential threat. Every engagement carried risk. The Bocage, with its narrow lanes and sudden corners, became a nightmare labyrinth where a Firefly might be waiting around any hedgerow. Sergeant Cartwright, sitting in his Firefly that February morning, understood this shift viscerally. He had crewed a standard Sherman during the landing at Sword Beach. He had watched friends die when an 88mm round punched through their tank's frontal plate and detonated the ammunition storage. He had felt the helplessness of firing at a distant Panther and seeing his round spark harmlessly off its glacis. The Firefly gave him something he had not felt in months: agency. The ability to fight back on equal terms. The Germans adapted, but adaptation came with costs. Panzer units began training to identify Fireflies by their longer gun barrels and prioritize them in engagements. German intelligence circulated recognition guides. Tank commanders were instructed to focus fire on the Firefly first, even if it meant ignoring more immediate threats. This tactical shift had unintended consequences. It meant German tanks often opened fire prematurely, revealing their positions to engage a single high-value target, which exposed them to fire from the other Shermans in the troop. At Caney, on July 18th during Operation Goodwood, A single Firefly commanded by Lieutenant John Gorman ambushed a column of Panthers moving through a sunken road. Gorman's tank was positioned in an orchard, partially concealed by apple trees heavy with unripe fruit. The Panthers were moving in file, confident, their commanders unbuttoned and scanning for threats in the open fields to their left. Gorman waited until the lead Panther passed his position, then fired into the second tank's side armor at point-blank range, less than 100 yards. The APDS round penetrated the engine deck and ignited the fuel tanks. The Panther exploded, blocking the road. The third Panther tried to reverse. Gorman's gunner fired again, striking the turret ring. The Panther slewed sideways, immobilized. The fourth Panther managed to traverse its gun toward the orchard, but by then the other Shermans and Gorman's troop had opened fire from different angles. In 90 seconds, 4 Panthers were destroyed. Gorman's Firefly took a single hit, a glancing 75mm round from a Panzer IV that scarred the hull, but did not penetrate. The engagement was studied at British armored training schools for the rest of the war. It illustrated the Firefly's tactical value, not as a dueling weapon but as an ambush predator. The Germans had built their tanks for open field superiority, for long-range gunnery duels where their superior optics and armor thickness gave them the advantage. The Firefly turned the bocage into a close-quarters killing ground where those advantages dissolved. But the Firefly was not invincible. Its long gun made it front-heavy, which stressed the Sherman's suspension and reduced reliability. The 17-pounder's recoil was violent enough that crews had to brace themselves before firing or risk injury. The gun's length made navigation through narrow streets and dense woodland difficult. Firefly commanders learned to avoid tight turns where the barrel might strike trees or buildings. And the ammunition storage was problematic. APDS rounds were longer than standard shells, which meant Fireflies carried fewer rounds overall, roughly 77 compared to 90 in a standard Sherman. Most critically, the Firefly attracted attention. German soldiers learned to recognize the longer barrel and would call in artillery, airstrikes, or anti-tank teams specifically to neutralize Fireflies. British crews adopted elaborate camouflage schemes, painting false muzzle brakes on standard Shermans to confuse identification, covering the Firefly's distinctive barrel with foliage, even parking Fireflies behind standard Shermans to mask their silhouettes. Survival required deception. Trooper William Metcalf, a Firefly loader with the 3rd Royal Tank Regiment, recalled the constant tension. Every time we moved into a new position, we knew we were the priority target. Jerry wanted us dead more than anything else. You'd hear the order to advance and your stomach would drop because you knew someone was watching for the long barrel. Someone had a Panzerfaust or a Pak 40 zeroed in, waiting. But we also knew we were the only thing keeping the rest of the troop alive. If a tiger showed up, we were the ones who could stop it. This duality, being both the hunter and the hunted, defined the Firefly experience. Crews developed a particular kind of vigilance, a hyper-awareness that bordered on paranoia. They scanned every hedgerow, every shadowed barn, every distant tree line for the angular shape of a German tank. They memorized the ranges where their gun was most effective. They practiced target acquisition until they could identify tank types in seconds. They lived in a state of compressed time, where entire battles unfolded in the span of a heartbeat. Spot the target, range it, fire, then move before return fire arrived. The symbolic weight of the Firefly extended beyond its tactical role. It represented something the Germans had not anticipated: Allied adaptability. The Third Reich's military culture prided itself on superior engineering and tactical doctrine. German officers believed that better equipment, wielded by better trained soldiers, would always defeat numerical superiority. The Firefly proved this belief false. The Allies had taken an adequate tank and transformed it into a tiger killer, not through revolutionary design, but through pragmatic improvisation. They had identified a weakness, found a solution, and implemented it rapidly across hundreds of tanks. This capacity for adaptation was, in its own way, more threatening than any single weapon. It suggested that the Allies could respond to any German advantage, that they possessed an institutional flexibility the Wehrmacht lacked. German tanks were masterpieces of over-engineering, complex, difficult to produce, impossible to repair in the field. The Firefly was a hybrid, a jury-rigged solution that should not have worked as well as it did. But it worked because the Allies accepted imperfection, prioritized results over purity, and trusted their crews to make flawed tools effective. There was an ideological dimension to this difference. The Nazi regime fetishized technological supremacy as proof of racial superiority. The Tiger tank was not merely a weapon. It was a statement, a physical embodiment of the master race's supposed dominance. When Fireflies began destroying Tigers, they were not just eliminating machines. They were dismantling a mythology. SS Obersturmführer Michael Wittmann, one of the Wehrmacht's most celebrated tank aces, was killed on August 8, 1944, near the town of Sinto. His Tiger was struck by at least 3 17-pounder rounds in rapid succession. The exact circumstances remain disputed. Some accounts credit a Firefly from the Northamptonshire Yeomanry. Others suggest multiple tanks engaged him simultaneously. But the outcome was undeniable. Wittmann's Tiger exploded, killing him and his crew instantly. German propaganda had portrayed Wittmann as invincible, a knight in a steel chariot. His death, struck down by the very weapon German commanders had once dismissed, carried symbolic resonance that rippled through panzer units. After Wittmann's death, German tank crews exhibited a new caution. Gone was the aggressive confidence of early Normandy, when Tigers would advance boldly to crush Allied positions. Now they maneuvered defensively, prioritizing survival over dominance. Morale began to fracture. Veterans who had fought in Russia spoke openly about the difference. On the Eastern Front, German armor still held qualitative superiority. In the West, the odds had evened. The Firefly also changed Allied tactics. British and Canadian armored regiments developed new engagement doctrines centered on the Firefly's capabilities. Standard Shermans would act as bait, drawing German fire and attention while the Firefly positioned for a killing shot. Infantry would coordinate with Fireflies to flush German tanks from concealed positions. Artillery spotters learned to call in fire missions that would force German armor to move, exposing themselves to waiting Fireflies. At Falaise, during the encirclement of German forces in August 1944, Fireflies played a crucial role in destroying retreating panzer units. German tanks, low on fuel and ammunition, attempted to break through Allied lines in desperate armored charges. Fireflies positioned on high ground overlooked the escape routes and engaged targets at extended ranges, knocking out Panthers and Tigers before they could close to effective firing distance. The roads through the Falaise pocket became graveyards of German armor, burned-out hulks stacked in ditches, testament to the Firefly's lethality. But statistics alone do not capture what the Firefly meant to the men who crewed them. Sergeant Cartwright, in his after-action report filed on February 19, 1944, wrote, "We are no longer victims. For months we fought knowing that every engagement was a dice roll, that our best hope was to survive long enough to flank them. Now we can look a tiger in the eye and win. That changes a man. It changes how he thinks about himself and what he's doing here. We are not sacrifices anymore. We are equals." This psychological transformation was perhaps the Firefly's most profound impact. It restored agency to Allied tank crews, gave them belief in their ability to influence outcomes rather than merely endure them. Morale, which had been brittle in the early weeks of Normandy, solidified. Men who had been preparing themselves for probable death began to think about surviving the war. The Germans conversely experienced the inverse. The invincibility of their heavy tanks had been a psychological anchor, a source of confidence that allowed them to rationalize the broader strategic collapse. As long as a Tiger crew believed they were superior in combat, they could tell themselves that defeat was temporary, that better tactics or reinforcements would turn the tide. The Firefly eroded that foundation. German tankers began to speak of the war in fatalistic terms, of holding out until inevitable surrender, of fighting not to win, but to delay the end. Intelligence officers analyzing captured German correspondence noted a recurring theme: disillusionment with promises made by leadership. German soldiers had been told their equipment was the best in the world, that their sacrifices served a glorious cause. The Firefly's success suggested otherwise. If a modified Allied tank could destroy a Tiger, then perhaps the propaganda had been lies. And if the propaganda was lies, what else had they been deceived about? This erosion of belief was gradual but cumulative. Each destroyed Tiger, each knocked out Panther, each German crew that bailed out of their burning tank and lived to tell about it, all of it chipped away at the Nazi regime's narrative of inevitable victory. The Firefly became a symbol not just of Allied material strength, but of the fundamental fragility of fascist mythology. By the autumn of 1944, as Allied armies pushed into the Low Countries and approached the German border, Fireflies had become standard equipment in British and Canadian armored regiments. Crews painted kill markings on their barrels, small rings or crosses indicating confirmed tank kills. Some Fireflies accumulated 10, 15, even 20 marks. They had become hunter-killers, sought after by commanders for critical engagements, respected by their own infantry and feared by the enemy. The German response was to deploy even heavier tanks, the Tiger II, with its even thicker armor and longer 80mm gun. But the Tiger II was rare, plagued by mechanical unreliability and too heavy for many bridges. It represented the Wehrmacht's strategic dead end. Ever more complex machines built in ever smaller numbers, wonders of engineering that could not alter the war's trajectory. The Firefly, crude and hybrid, continued to destroy them. There is a photograph taken in March 1945, near the Rhine crossing at Wesel. It shows a Firefly parked on a muddy embankment, its crew sitting on the hull smoking cigarettes. Behind them, across the river, the ruins of a German town smolder. The Firefly's barrel is pointed skyward, and on its side, painted in white, are 17 small crosses. The crew looks exhausted but calm. They have done their job. They have survived. That photograph captures something essential about the Firefly's legacy. It was not an elegant weapon. It was not the product of inspired genius. It was a solution born of desperation and pragmatism, assembled by engineers who understood that perfection was the enemy of adequacy. It worked because the men who crewed it made it work, because they adapted to its quirks, compensated for its flaws, and wielded it with a skill born of necessity. In the end, the story of the Firefly is a story about transformation, not just of machines but of men and ideas. It is about the moment when the hunted became hunters, when numerical inferiority was overcome by tactical innovation, when the mythology of invincibility shattered against the reality of tungsten cores traveling at 3,000 feet per second. The German commanders, who mocked the Sherman's weak gun, learned a lesson they could not afford, that wars are not won by the elegance of weapons, but by the adaptability of the societies that wield them. The Firefly was democracy's answer to fascism's tigers, imperfect, practical, and ultimately unstoppable. And in the cold Norman fields of February 1944, Sergeant Cartwright sat in his Firefly and waited for the tiger he knew was coming, his hands steady on the controls, his faith restored in the simple proposition that courage combined with adequate tools could defeat tyranny's finest machines. That morning, when the tiger appeared, he destroyed it with a single shot.